A name everyone knows. Even those who've never opened a single one of his books know his name. Sigmund Freud is the man who changed the way we think about ourselves. In this video, you'll learn how a boy from Moravia became a doctor and then the father of psychoanalysis, how the famous couch appeared, and why Freud stopped believing in hypnosis. Why did he insist that the root of our anxieties lies in repressed wishes? How did he fight cancer, hide from the Nazis, and keep dictating books to the very end? And most importantly, why his ideas are still alive today, in film, in language, in therapy, in culture, and in us. This is a story about the unconscious, fears, desires, and the man who gave them a voice. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Bedtime stories are posted here every day. The Boy from Moravia. Early Years and Family. Sigmund Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, today Pribor, in the Czech Republic. The world took little notice of his birth, but in his home it was a momentous day. Sigmund was the first child of his father Jakob Freud's third marriage, and the first son of his mother, Amalia, who was 20 years younger than her husband. Jakob was 40 at the time, Amalia 20. He was not very successful, but was an educated wool merchant, a Jew of Hasidic origin from Galicia. Amalia, energetic, decisive, and highly emotional, was the daughter of a prosperous merchant. From infancy, Sigmund was surrounded by his mother's special attention and tenderness. He later recalled that she called him "my golden Siggy," and by his own admission, this left a lifelong mark. The Freuds were neither poor nor especially wealthy. After the first years in Moravia, they moved to Austria and settled in Vienna's Leopoldstadt, a district with a large Jewish population. Economic and social reasons drove the move. Provincial trade was becoming less reliable, and the capital offered more opportunities, especially for the younger generation. Sigmund had two much older half-brothers from Jakob's first marriage, Emanuel and Philip, who soon left home to start families of their own. One of them even became a father around the time Sigmund was born, so Freud's nephew was his peer. An odd tangle of kinship roles he later remembered as something that may have nudged his interest in family structures and dynamics. The home had a special atmosphere. His father, well-read though not very religious, often told jokes, quoted Jewish parables, and talked politics. Yet his mother remained the main spiritual anchor. Her faith in her son, relatives said, was almost prophetic. From early on, the idea floated through the house that he was an unusual child, and Sigmund seemed ready to accept the role. He showed exceptional aptitude for learning. By 8, he was reading Shakespeare. By adolescence, he had mastered Latin, Greek, and French. In a household where money was often tight, he was given his own room and candles for night study, a privilege the other children didn't have. He attended a German-language gymnasium and was consistently among the top students. When the family wondered whether to keep paying for his French lessons, Sigmund declared he would sooner give up meat than give up the teacher, a story remembered as a sign of his tenacity and willingness to sacrifice for knowledge. Freud was not especially outgoing. He preferred solitude, reading, and reflection. Literature, biology, philosophy drew him far more than street games. Early on, he grew fascinated with nature and devoured books on zoology and anatomy. In his upper school years, he conducted experiments on his own, and later, as a university student, he would study neurophysiology, peering at the nerve cells of eels under a microscope. Alongside intellect, a sensitivity to the inner life was forming. As a youth, he noticed how complex family relationships could be. He sensed a tension between his father and mother, observed his siblings, and later admitted that many of his intuitions came from childhood experience. He would go on to analyze the image of the father in the context of authority and power. He told how, as a child, he once heard a story from his father. When Jakub was young, a Christian shoved him in the street and his hat fell in the mud. "What did you do?" Sigmund asked. "I picked up the hat," came the answer. The boy felt disappointed. He had expected heroism, but got an image of submission. Later, he would say that in this episode, he first grasped the gap between expectation and reality. Freud grew up in a city where culture collided with tension. Viennese liberalism coexisted with rising anti-Semitism, academic science with prejudice. But he absorbed it all: German literature, philosophical ideas, scientific discipline, and an awareness of his own otherness. That inner tension became a driving force in his thought. By graduation, he already knew firmly he wanted science. In 1873, at 17, he entered the University of Vienna to study medicine. As he would later confess, he felt little calling for clinical practice. He was drawn not to healing bodies, but to understanding life's workings, and later the workings of the psyche. For now, though, the boy from Freiburg, living in a Vienna flat filled with books, candles, and a mother's attention, peered into scientific pages with a mix of longing and excitement, and whispered to himself in the dark, "One day, I'll understand how all this works."
Medicine, the brain, and cocaine. The road to psychiatry. When 17-year-old Freud entered the University of Vienna, he chose medicine not out of a desire to treat illness, but because it opened doors to the natural sciences, anatomy, biology, and physiology. He sought precision and systematic knowledge, and saw science as a path to truth about human nature. Early on, he became especially interested in zoology and neuroanatomy. Still a student, he joined the laboratory of Ernst Bruck, a leading Viennese physiologist and convinced materialist who taught that all life processes obey the laws of physics and chemistry. This deeply influenced Freud, strengthening his conviction that even the most complex phenomena, what he would later call psychic, must have scientific explanations. In Bruck's lab, Freud studied the microscopic structure of animal nervous systems. One of his first publications dealt with the nervous system of the river eel. Scientists then debated whether eels had male sexual organs. Freud tried to identify them through anatomical sections. Though inconclusive, his work showed persistence, care, and independence, qualities Bruck noticed and praised. Freud's medical training took about 8 years longer than most of his peers. Despite his lab successes, when he finally earned his degree, he realized that basic science would not provide financial stability. He was engaged to Martha Bernays, from a respected Hamburg Jewish family, and wanted to support a family as soon as possible. He left the lab to work as a physician's assistant at the General Hospital, rotating through various departments, including neurology and psychiatry. Under the famed neuropathologist Theodor Meinert, he performed brain autopsies, experiences that cemented his interest in nervous pathologies. He also began publishing. His study on aphasia anticipated later ideas, notably that mental functions could not be rigidly mapped to discrete brain zones, contra strict localizers. The most controversial episode of these years was his enthusiasm for certain drugs. Freud experimented on himself and wrote to Martha with excitement about surges of vigor, clarity, and alertness he felt after taking them. He saw therapeutic and scientific promise and even shared samples with colleagues. His friend, ophthalmologist Karl Kohler, inspired by Freud's suggestion, tested these substances in eye surgery and became the first to prove their strong local anesthetic effect. The discovery was sensational. Eye operations could now be performed without pain. Kohler lectured at conferences, and his name echoed across Europe. Freud, though he had given the initial nudge, remained in the shadows and took it hard. Worse followed. In the mid-1880s, he tried to help his colleague Ernst Fleischl von Marxow, who suffered from morphine addiction.
He proposed replacing morphine with a newer substance. The result was tragic. Fleischl developed a severe dependency with horrific hallucinations and profound mental disturbance. The story became known in medical circles and damaged for its reputation. He was accused of carelessness and naivete, later even of dangerous overconfidence. Freud suffered over this defeat. In letters, he defended himself, saying he had acted with good intentions and genuinely believed in therapeutic potential. But the episode likely made him step away from the topic for good, growing far more cautious in public claims. Meanwhile, his hospital work continued on childhood paralysis, speech disorders, motor and sensory impairments. His interest deepened in the invisible symptoms not explained by obvious brain damage. Increasingly, he saw patients with no organic findings who nonetheless suffered from paralysis, blindness, pains, and convulsions. More and more, he asked, what if the cause lies not in the brain as an organ, but in another, as yet unexplored level of human nature? By the mid-1880s, he was following French physicians, especially Jean-Martin Charcot, who studied hysteria and used hypnosis. From France came the impulse that made sense to him. The psyche might not just be a passive reflection of the brain, but an active force capable of shaping symptoms. He stood on the brink of change. A trip to Paris, meetings with Charcot, long talks with Joseph Breuer, and a discovery that would launch psychoanalysis. For the moment, though, he was still a neurologist straddling two worlds, exact science and the mysterious inner life no one had yet dared to systematize.
Charisma and hypnosis, the influence of Charcot and Breuer. By the mid-1880s, Freud was encountering patients whose complaints could not be explained by organic lesions, paralysis, tremors, visual or speech disorders, yet their bodies showed no anatomical pathology. These were classed under hysteria, a broad label often treated as excess female emotionality or even malingering. Freud suspected something deeper, tied to the inner life. Jean-Martin Charcot, head of the Salpêtrière in Paris, treated hysteria as a real illness fit for scientific study, and famously demonstrated in public lectures how hypnosis could evoke or relieve symptoms mimicking serious neurological disease. Freud won a research grant and spent about 5 months in Paris, attending Charcot's lectures almost daily. He was astonished that suggestion could alter bodily manifestations, lifting a paralysis, provoking convulsions, inducing or removing anesthesia. When a doctor asked how such symptoms could arise without anatomical cause, Charcot answered coolly, "But that is hysteria." For Freud, this was revelatory. Bodily symptoms could be expressions of hidden mental processes. Back in Vienna, he brought not just books, but a new idea. The psyche might not be a backdrop to illness, but its cause. He began using hypnosis, risking his reputation in a profession that still saw it as borderline quackery. Around the same time, he grew close to Joseph Breuer, who had treated Bertha Pappenheim, Anna O., for a complex of symptoms: paralysis, aphasia, sensory losses, visual and auditory hallucinations. Breuer noticed something striking. When she spoke about repressed feelings related to her father's illness and her own helplessness, she experienced catharsis, and her symptoms eased or vanished. She called it the talking cure and chimney sweeping. Breuer did not generalize theoretically. Freud did. From Anna O.'s case, he formed the idea that repressed emotions can convert into bodily symptoms. Unable to be consciously recognized or expressed in words, they persist as illness. He began to see symptoms as symbolic utterances with a hidden logic. He still used hypnosis, but soon noticed its limits. Not everyone could be hypnotized. Depth varied, effects were often short-lived. What intrigued him more was the very process of telling, the patient's return to forgotten events, emotional reliving, and release. He shifted from suggestion to verbal expression, dialogue, and understanding.
The birth of psychoanalysis, conversation
as cure. By the early 1890s, Freud was increasingly disappointed with hypnosis. The real work, he felt, began when the patients started to talk. He asked patients to say whatever came to mind, without organizing or censoring their thoughts. In this seemingly chaotic flow, connections emerged between symptoms and memories, between bodily reactions and experiences people hesitated to name. Thus, free association was born, not as a ready-made tool, but from observation, patience, and trial and error. Freud listened for repetitions, hesitations, affective spikes, unexpected images. He treated the patient's speech as a winding map of the unconscious, difficult but decipherable. His collaboration with Breuer produced Studies on Hysteria, 1895, presenting cases, including Anna O., and arguing that hysterical symptoms result from repressed emotions and that articulating them can bring relief. But serious disagreements surfaced, chiefly about sexuality. Based on his practice, Freud concluded that early sexual experiences, not necessarily narrowly traumatic, but repressed and unconscious, often lay at the root of neurotic symptoms. Sexuality, he believed, was a key to the whole of mental life. Breuer, the respectful, rejected such sweeping claims as risky. After publication, they parted ways. Freud proceeded largely alone, shunned by colleagues, rejected by journals, distrusted by patients. He kept meticulous case notes, finding recurring links between symptoms and forgotten memories, guilt, shame, anxiety. He wrote, "We do not cure, we help to remember, and therein lies our strength." In his flat at Berggasse 19, amid books, scores, antiquities, and a chair with a rug, he worked. Patients lay down, he sat behind them, out of sight, and listened, without interruption or hasty conclusions. He did not yet know his name would become a symbol of a new science. He simply listened and tried to grasp what the body says when language falls silent and what a person is saying in phrases that even to themselves seem meaningless.
Dreams, Oedipus, and the unconscious. Theory takes shape. In 1899, as Europe prepared for a new century, a book by a little-known Viennese physician appeared in Leipzig, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. The publisher printed 1900 on the title page to give it symbolic weight, as if it opened not only a calendar era, but a new era in understanding the human being. Freud had worked on it for 4 years and called it his most important book. It wasn't merely about dreams. It was an attempt to reveal the laws by which the unconscious lives and speaks. The book begins with his own dream, the Irma dream of July 24, 1895. At first, it seemed nonsensical, but careful analysis showed how each detail linked to his anxieties, guilt, and wish to absolve himself. He concluded, dreams are not random nonsense, but disguised wish fulfillments. From this, he built a theory. Dreams arise when repressed wishes push toward expression in distorted form. He distinguished manifest content, what we recall, from latent content, the hidden meaning, and described the dream work, condensation, displacement, visual symbolism, and secondary revision. Analyzing patients and literary dreams, he argued that nearly every dream contains a wish excluded from consciousness. Desire for power, possession, revenge, recognition, any impulse deemed unacceptable or frightening. The wish does not vanish, it persists in the unconscious, showing up in symbols, slips, fantasies, dreams, even bodily symptoms. He also advanced what would become central,
In early childhood, each person experiences an inner conflict where desire and prohibition clash acutely, the Oedipus complex. He did not claim children literally fall in love with one parent and want to remove the other. He described an unconscious dynamic of intense attachment mixed with guilt and fear of punishment, illustrated by the myth of Oedipus. Reception was harsh. Many deemed the book unscientific and obsessively sexual. Fewer than 600 copies sold in the first years. But Freud was sure he had taken the decisive step: psychoanalysis as a systematic theory and method.
The Battle of Ideas, an outsider among scientists. Freud believed he had built a theoretical foundation for a new approach to the psyche, but the medical world, rooted in physiology and neurology, wasn't ready. His claims about unconscious motives, infantile sexuality, repression, and dreams as expressions of hidden desire contradicted prevailing views. He felt isolated, yet persisted, writing, revising, practicing. Gradually, allies appeared: Wilhelm Steckel, Karl Abraham, Oskar Pfister, Sandor Ferenczi, and the increasingly prominent Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung. With Steckel, Freud formed an informal psychological society, meeting at Berggasse 19, soon known as the Wednesday Psychological Society. They discussed papers, cases, and theory in a laboratory-like atmosphere, intense and frank. Freud's authority rested not on position, but on depth and consistency, and on his willingness to defend his view. By the mid-1900s, a small but solid circle had formed. They called themselves psychoanalysts. Tensions also arose: dissent from Steckel, Adler, and others, but for a time Freud held things together, organizing meetings, corresponding widely, and guiding new participants. He was no longer alone.
The break with Jung, a clash of fathers and sons. In 1906, Jung wrote to Freud. They were separated by nearly 20 years and different cultural worlds, but united by acute attention to the psyche. Their first meeting in March 1907 lasted over 13 hours. Freud saw in Jung someone who could carry psychoanalysis beyond the German-speaking world. Charismatic, institutionally positioned, and importantly for Freud, not Jewish, which he hoped would ease acceptance. Jung soon became central. He helped organize the Salzburg Congress and, at Freud's urging, became the first president of the new International Psychoanalytic Association. Freud publicly dubbed him the Crown Prince of the Unconscious. But divergence grew. Jung broadened libido into a general life energy, turned towards symbolism, religion, and mythology, and developed the idea of a collective unconscious, moves Freud viewed as metaphysical and unscientific. Their 1909 trip to the U.S. was outwardly successful, but private tensions sharpened. An oft-retold incident had Freud say he could not reveal everything lest he undermine his own authority. Jung retorted that science should not fear truth. Shortly after, Freud briefly fainted, later read as psychosomatic strain. The split came in 1912 with Jung's Psychology of the Unconscious, which criticized Freud's sexual theory as too narrow. Freud felt betrayed. Their correspondence ceased. Jung went on to found analytical psychology, archetypes, the collective unconscious, individuation, the self. Freud never again trusted a disciple so fully, tightening his control over the movement and no longer seeking a single heir. The rupture reshaped 20th century psychology,
branching approaches and sharpening lines between the symbolic and the clinical, the religious and the scientific, the archetypal and repression-based views.
War, Death, and the Psyche, The End of Illusions. By 1914, Freud had introduced ideas like narcissism and was moving toward a more complex view of the mind. Then, World War I shattered European faith in progress. 3 of his sons, Martin, Ernst, and Oliver, served. All returned alive, but the experience marked them and their father. In 1920, his daughter Sophie died of influenza complications, a devastating personal blow that tested his own theories of mourning. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, he proposed a death drive opposing libido, a pull toward quiescence and dissolution that could explain traumatic repetition, self-destructiveness, and soldiers' recurring nightmares that offered no relief. He then formulated the structural model, id, ego, superego, fully presented in The Ego and the Id, 1923, to explain conflict not just as levels of consciousness, but as interacting agencies. His health deteriorated. In 1923, he was diagnosed with cancer of the upper jaw and palate, undergoing numerous painful surgeries and wearing an obturator. Yet he kept writing, The Future of an Illusion, Civilization and Its Discontents, Why War? His outlook grew more tragic. Alongside love and connection, humans bear a stubborn drive to destroy. Psychoanalysis, he now felt, was less a cure than a means of understanding. Emigration and the final years. By the early 1930s, after nearly a decade of illness and more than 30 operations, many under local anesthesia, Freud continued to write and meet students. Meanwhile, Hitler rose to power. Psychoanalysis, branded Jewish science, came under threat. In May 1933, Freud's books were burned on Berlin's Opernplatz. He quipped, "What progress! In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." He remained at Berggasse 19 in Vienna until the Anschluss of March 1938. Searches and arrests reached his home. His daughter Anna was detained and interrogated by the Gestapo. With help from friends, especially British analyst Ernest Jones and U.S. diplomat William Bullitt, the Nazis allowed the family to leave. Forced to sign a statement that he had not been mistreated, Freud added beneath it, "I can heartily recommend the Gestapo." In June 1938, he left the home of more than 80 years and moved to London with his wife Martha, daughter Anna, physician Max Schur, and household staff. They brought nearly everything: books, antiquities, and the famous couch. At 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, later the Freud Museum, he recreated his study almost exactly. In London, he completed one of his boldest works, Moses and Monotheism, hypothesizing that Moses was an Egyptian follower of Akhenaten and was killed by his own people, who then repressed the memory. The book angered many Jewish readers at a time of real danger, but Freud insisted that intellectual honesty required analysis, not silence. His body failing, speech and eating painful, he nevertheless remained mentally clear, read, received visitors, and discussed analytic ideas with Anna, now his closest collaborator, and soon steward of his legacy. In September 1939, shortly after World War II began, he told Schur to end his suffering as promised long ago. On September 21st, Schur administered the first dose of morphine, and then another, and on the morning of September 23rd, Freud died peacefully. He was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium in London. His ashes were placed in an ancient Greek urn he had chosen years earlier. A life lived on the border of science, philosophy, and literature had ended, but the ideas were already traveling the world. Legacy: What Freud Left the World. After his death in London and amid the rupture of World War II, Freud's ideas survived him and the century's political catastrophes. His youngest daughter, Anna Freud, became a principal continuator, systematizing ego defenses, repression, projection, identification, rationalization, suppression, and helping found ego psychology, focused not only on the unconscious, but on the ego as an adaptive structure. She also pioneered child analysis. In the United States, Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and René Spitz adapted psychoanalytic principles to empirical research and education. In Britain, Melanie Klein, often in polemics with Anna Freud, argued that unconscious conflict appears in infancy and that the mother is central in early mental life, sparking the famous controversial discussions. Beyond medicine, Freud's impact spread wider. Writers like Thomas Mann, Franz Kafka, James Joyce, and Marcel Proust probed motivation, conflict, and the unacknowledged impulse through a Freudian lens. In cinema, Alfred Hitchcock and Ingmar Bergman drew on the unconscious. In popular culture, terms like complex, sublimation, and Oedipal conflict entered everyday speech, often imprecisely. From mid-century on, critics multiplied. Philosopher Karl Popper called psychoanalysis unscientific because its claims were unfalsifiable. Behaviorism and cognitive science, with experimental methods, pushed analytic approaches to the academic margins. Yet, in the humanities, Freud's ideas found a second life. French post-structuralists like Jacques Lacan and Michel Foucault used psychoanalysis to analyze power, language, identity, and sexuality. Lacan famously reframed the field through linguistics, claiming the unconscious is structured like a language. Even where the clinical model receded, Freud's core insights endured: the significance of childhood, the role of the unconscious, the conflict between instinct and norm. Psychoanalysis became as much a method for interpreting culture as a medical tool, inspiring therapists, writers, filmmakers, artists, critics, and scholars. He did not leave a closed dogma. He left a language for fears, desires, dreams, symptoms, traumas, and drives, for their transformations. He gave us a way to listen to what had previously been mute, and that, above all, is his legacy.